Sound good?
Sounds great.
All right.
All right.
So we are recording. Go ahead.
Great. So, hello all. Welcome to the scheduled debate. My name is UpperLowerEastSide, and over the weekend, I had a suggestion with my friend who's joined us, PayPal, about the relationship between socialism and identity politics. And so the topic would be discussing that relationship. It could be, for example, discussing like, can socialism exist apart from identity politics? Like, can these two be different political concepts and movements, and without like any extensive interconnection between them? Can these two movements, do they require each other? Is this like a symbiotic relationship, or does socialism require intersectionality? But intersectionality perhaps doesn't. Sorry, not intersectionality. Does socialism require identity politics, but not vice versa? Or does identity politics require socialism to operate, but not vice versa? Or any sort of iteration in between that? And so, again, I appreciate you all coming, and that's sort of the discussion point. My my personal take, as I stated a little bit earlier, is perhaps somewhere in the middle, that socialism would require identity politics to a certain extent, which I can flesh out later, but that's my personal take, and that's the topic at hand, and would love to hear what you all have to say on that subject as well, and or listen to.
Okay. I guess my position is that the two are inseparable. Identity politics requires a class analysis and a structural analysis of the economic system of capitalism, and also that socialism requires identity politics in order to be sustainable, in order to actually gather the number of workers needed in order to create a workers' movement that organizes itself as a unified class. And so long as there's any kind of like systemic oppression, there's going to be identities that form in reaction to that oppression. And so until there's like a completely egalitarian society, there's going to be identity politics which form. And in order to be sustainable, socialism has to incorporate those identity politics into its sort of electoral system, if you will, or legislative system, its democratic processes.
Okay, and then I will be taking the other view. So for context, I am primarily an anarchist, more anarcho-communist in a lot of ways. And so I will be taking the position that identity politics and socialism are completely separable. And to be clear, I'm coming at this from a perspective of anarchism. I'm not too familiar with socialism as like a state apparatus, I guess you could call it.
Okay. Upper Lower East Side, why don't you take this the direction that you're hoping to take it? So go ahead and ask them your questions.
Well, I guess the first question for anyone who's interested in talking is specifically regarding your own interpretation of what this relationship is between socialism and socialism and identity politics. What more specific aspects of, socialism or identity politics would require sort of the other in formulating like a political movement or political analysis, whether it be on racism, sexism, intersectionality between racism, sexism, and classism, et cetera, et cetera. So the first question is just like a little bit more elaboration on what aspects of our existing politics do you see the two needing to interconnect or not interconnect?
Well, for me, my response to that would be historical materialism. The fact that there are real substantial differences between various identities that are caused by historically determined structural processes within society. And these occur both like within a country, within a region, within a city, and also internationally through the globalized process of capital accumulation and worker exploitation. And so there is a material basis for these things, for identities, and identity politics are a reactionary response to systemic oppression as identities are formed through these historical processes of exploitation. So, for example, white supremacy as a systemic force created the identities of black or indigenous or non-white. And so these groups, in response to these historical processes of systemic repression, form groups where they sort of like, it's a process of epistemological understanding their reality. So black folks get together and start to understand this concept of white supremacy. Women get together and start to understand the process of patriarchy and such. So they're tied through historical lenses, through a historical context, and that they're necessary because in order to create an actually egalitarian society, whether that's an anarcho-capitalist or an eco-communist, or sort of like state-run thing, you need to kind of always be chipping away at these historical processes that create real differences between people based upon their identities.
I'm curious if class itself is being considered an identity in this situation, because if class itself is considered an identity, then this would be impossible to argue against. So, like, are we going to make that distinction here that class is not considered a form of identity?
I guess it's interesting. So I would say like worker versus owner would be like an identity. So I guess that would be the class of bourgeois and proletariat.
Yeah, that makes it basically impossible to argue against.
Well, I think that the way you would separate those two then is saying that there's a sort of maybe a hierarchy of identities, or like, because like the structural process, the material process of capitalist exploitation and accumulation, for some reason maybe outranks the other identities or something like that. Or like in a socialist, the process of socialism, the movement of socialism is about rectifying this relationship between owner and worker. And so it is sort of like, I think that's how you would separate them. And you'd say that kind of like the, systems of white supremacy and patriarchy, etc., are somehow separate from the system of capitalist exploitation and accumulation.
So the main thing that comes to mind for me is that you could theoretically have a commune, a society that doesn't engage with identity politics in any way, because you have like a culturally homogenous group where there are no distinct differences between identity. There is sort of like a shared group identity. And I propose that that's actually probably the best for cohesion. But obviously there are people who have values of multiculturalism or of diversity within their communities. But people who mutually value that will themselves have their own methods of not really identity politics so much as systems in place to address differences where they do occur because of that shared value.
Right. So if I could try and repeat what I heard you say, Sparks, you're detailing that there can be sort of, and I'm going to throw out this word, isolated anarcho communes, which are homogenous to such an extent that identity politics are irrelevant because they're maybe, let's say, cultural traits outweigh any kind of like separation, and that there's no process needed, there's no identity politics sort of movement necessary because they have democratic processes of, let's say, like addressing inequality or oppression within that commune society, and so there's no need to sort of resort to the identity grouping. Am I hearing you correctly?
Yeah, I think that's right.
I guess there's two things that come to mind, and one is that there's always going to be some sort of gender difference, and there's also going to be like an age difference thing going on. So that's like one thing I'm thinking about, that we have to also like consider the oppression that parents put upon children, for example. You know what I mean? Like we'd have to, as long as there's some sort of difference within a society, there's going to be a pressure to rectify that difference and create a more just society. And so I think that there needs to be some sort of process. And I guess, like, do we call that identity politics at that point? And it sounds like you're kind of saying no, because that would be rectified through some other democratic process within this culture. That's like one aspect that I'd like you to respond to. And I think there's another one, though, is like, where is this commune? You know what I mean? Like it's so like hypothetical that it somehow doesn't exist in reality. You know what I'm saying? So like I live in Tucson, Arizona. Like to our west, we have the Tohono O'odham tribe, right? So they're homogenous identity. But I think that because of historical conditions, like if they were to become a sort of like completely self-sufficient anarcho-commune, there would be traces of let's say like alcoholism or trauma within the community, domestic violence, poverty, and these kind of like those sort of pains that are existing because of historical conditions would have reverberations within their like commune, and I feel like that would create, like the identity of being a child in a domestic violence situation. You know what I'm saying? Or like a partner with an alcoholic, right? And so like they don't even necessarily need to be about race, class, and sex at that point. It becomes about relationships between human beings, because there's always sort of like two sides of a relationship. And I think that like what we really saw, for instance, from the feminist movement is that when women got together within a patriarchy system, is they started to realize that their individual experiences were actually political in nature through the process of sort of like forming an identity or recognizing their identity, in a sort of like epistemological process of like getting together and talking about what they were going through and recognizing this is actually like a systemic thing going on.
Wondering if, hold on, I'm trying to get this together. Like because of the harms that exist presently, if a commune were to form, yes, we would definitely have to deal with the repercussions of that, the generational trauma of that. When I think of identity politics, I think of friction between, I guess, between classes. If we're excluding the worker class, because like in a fully economically socialist kind of society, you could still have identity conflict. And so I don't think that both need to be addressed in tandem necessarily. Realistically, we will address them just for the health of the community. It's important to address the harms that have occurred. But I don't think it's tied to the economic system that a commune chooses to use. Like even with the age thing, or you talk about kids who grow up in DV situations, those don't necessarily form distinct classes that have frictions between them.
Yeah, so are you saying maybe there's like a power aspect? Because when you're talking about classes, like it seems to be like, is there a power aspect in that? Is that kind of what you're hinting at? And so you're saying that like separate from the economic system, which creates power disparities. I'm just kind of going off of a loose chain here. Are you kind of maybe referencing power dynamics?
I'm unsure.
Yeah, so I guess I'm hearing you say that in a system that has detached itself from capitalism, these sort of like frictions and harms that recur, even if they occur sort of like systemically, they're not wrapped up in the economic processes of reproducing the society, and so therefore it doesn't create a separate identity. Is that what you're saying?
Still not sure. So when we talk about identity politics, when we talk about separate identities, what I envision is having like to have a political movement is to identify a point of friction and to sort of act against another group, you could say. Like there's it's not really against, it's like advocacy for a particular group where I'm not sure. I'm not sure that it is about power necessarily.
Okay, maybe you're saying that the friction that occurs between, I don't know if I want to use the word identities, but with, let's say, individuals within society gets manifested into the class sort of structure, and then therefore the sort of identity politics is necessary? And so you're saying that without the class structure, there isn't the necessity of identity politics? For instance, like in a capitalist society, a lot of the wage gap, let's just throw out there, between men and women, right? So that's like the patriarchy in terms of like the feminist anti-capitalist framework or thinking on the subject. That the interpersonal oppression of patriarchy gets manifested into the class relationship. Is that kind of what you're talking about, or is that jiving with what you're talking about?
I'm going to do some more thinking. Upper Lower East Side, do you have anything to say about what we've talked about so far?
Oh yeah, thanks for letting me have one. I personally think that part of the relationship does relate to power dynamics, but specifically within the power dynamics of what would presumably be the socialist movement to, work towards the abolition of capitalism. That in the need to deal with groups from different geographies, different ethnic groups, different racial groups, et cetera, that this would require the need to incorporate some element of identity politics, whether it be, gender, sexual orientation, ethnicity, et cetera, in order to have a viable movement moving forward. And I think that's one area where socialism could draw on identity politics, more so with regards to the material issues that exist within these groups that I think was being discussed earlier, and the need for these to be addressed and overcome to have a viable movement. PayPal, do you have any commentary on what we've said so far?
Sure. So really somehow in my mind, there's sort of like two questions here, and it seems from what I sort of gathered that both of you are answering these two questions ways, both of the questions. So the first direction is, does socialism require these other identity movements? And it seems like, and the other direction is, do the identity movement, or to be realize their goals, they require socialism also? It seems like what I heard. I'm not sure if you answered both of you. I think I heard Ray Sparks claim that it is conceivable to have a socialism that also still hasn't completed the goals of, let's say, feminism, whatever. So in particular, you could have, or you could conceive of a racist socialism. I think that's what I sort of gathered. And then similarly,
Yeah, that's correct.
right? Okay.
Oh, okay. So I was sorry. I thought that Sparks had said that you could conceive of a socialism that had no need for these identity movements anymore because the culture was so homogenous, and that seems separate from conceiving a socialism that has some, let's say, element of racism existing within it.
Well, so if you have a completely homogenous group that has socialism within their commune, they can have, opinions about other groups that other groups are inferior or whatever, and they never actually have to interact with them. And so within the commune, identity politics doesn't happen. And because the commune is sort of like this unit of self-sufficiency, ideally, they don't actually have to interact with the people that they feel to be inferior. So socialism still works within their commune while they retain their racism.
Okay, I got you. PayPack, please continue.
Sorry, so just to clarify, so is the argument that this is the only possible way you could have, let's say, racist socialism, or could you have racism within the same socialism?
I don't think a commune would work very well if there was racism within the commune.
I guess that goes to my point with regards to like even before the existence of the commune, like a successful movement would be pretty impaired if it would be extremely impaired if it were like racist or sexist or homophobic, transphobic, etc.
Yeah, so if you're assuming that a socialist movement would need to be, say, like globally unified or even unified among a great many people, I think in order for that to happen, you do need to address whatever that is. But that's like you're addressing like the root itself of bigotry, which is a pretty big ask. I don't know if that's realistic to expect before a socialist movement can get off the ground.
Sorry, so now it sounds like you're arguing that in order for the movements to be realize their goals, you would need socialism first to happen?
I think it depends on what scale you're doing it from. Because like as an anarchist, I envision everything on small scale. And so like it's possible to break away from the greater society, for example, and have basically whatever you want within the confines of a commune. But if you're looking for some sense of homogeneity, or like I know that state socialism, or what I, as a joke, call like global domination socialism, there's a lot of other things that you need to consider and a lot of other hurdles that you need to get over. And so if we're talking about socialism in that sense, I don't know if it's I don't know if it's reasonable to begin with to have global domination socialism. I think it introduces a lot of problems, and identity politics is going to be one of them, just because of the scale.
So perhaps it's the level of the movement with regards to how it starts, perhaps like in terms of baby steps for any sort of like emancipatory movement that we would need to start like at the community level and perhaps deal with the specific nuances, political, economic nuances of those communities where they are, instead of going big, going home immediately. Is that what you're saying?
Wait, that I think socialism generally is best done small scale? Is that the question?
Well, I was wondering, like you said, as an anarchist, well, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seemed like you were saying as an anarchist that you see stuff in the small scale. So I was wondering with regards to like the establishment of like an anarchist like commune, that what we would be talking about would be implementing this like locally versus like some broader, you know, nationwide or like international scale movement.
Yeah, it would be established at the local level first.
Okay. So, in terms of at the local level, how would you see like identity politics, for example, either not playing a role or like playing a role, but perhaps like within a unique particular within that community?
I think that communes will usually form best with people with shared values. And that's usually a thing that is brought up with, any anarchist theory or any of it that I've read so far. That there does need to be an agreement of values on the ground level, or else the commune will dissolve. You need that social cohesion.
Okay. So this would be like a prerequisite slash perhaps something that could be developed through mutual aid or something of that sort.
What do you mean by developed?
Well, I was wondering, like, would this be the social cohesion? Do you see this as like a necessary prerequisite to like any sort of successful social movement for the abolition of capitalism or what have you, or is this something that can also be a political goal of like anarchists or socialists?
Like increased cohesion being a political goal?
Yes.
I'm not really sure. I'm
I guess,
thinking about with with a larger movement, once you get beyond a certain size, it's not really going to be practical to have social cohesion. So there's that. I know that like socialist groups are notorious for having infighting and then they split apart. So I think that speaks to the need for some set of central values. But beyond that, you might get institutions that you're forming to keep everyone in line, so to speak. Um, and that would be something that you could do in the absence of cohesion. And then capitalism itself does this by reducing everything down to money so that you don't need social cohesion at all because you can trade in dollars.
okay, okay. Uh, PayPal, do you have anything you'd like to add? Um, Kurt, is there anything you would like to add?
Yeah, I guess it sounded to me like even in the small scale, there needs to be some degree of, I would call it like maybe egalitarianism. that is still necessary. You know what I mean? So like, I think like especially with feminism, for example, would be a necessary sort of identity politic in order to create that commune in a sustainable way. I mean, you know, because it sounds to me like you're saying that when things get so large, and it is just impossible, or at least it seems so, maybe given today's present conditions, to really settle all the disputes and frictions that it can occur. And you're saying that like the avoidance, I guess, of those is like the only way to kind of create large scale cohesion. Because it sounded to me like you had thrown in the idea that capitalism just completely ignores all these, because it only cares about, you know, the color green, if you will. Yeah, so I guess I'm just saying that I feel like even in the small scale context, there's still going to be differences between people. Although I guess again, then we're touching back on that whole thing about that I was asking you about power, and you were saying that like it separate from the class system, these frictions between people don't manifest into identities. So I think I don't know if we wanted to retouch upon that a bit.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting the pitch that like feminism or being a woman as an identity is always going to exist and cause friction. I don't think I agree with that premise.
So I guess I would say that hasn't like every society had some sort of sexual distinction or gender distinction, and not necessarily a domination of one over the other, but like, you know, some sort of recognition of differences.
Is your proposal that differences between people constitute an identity with class interest?
They constitute they constitute differences between people create a necessity to negotiate those differences through the sort of like process of you know, reproducing the society, whether that's through the capitalist ownership or whether that's through some sort of democratic process of production and distribution. Like I'm thinking of particularly, this is like really hyper specific, but in like Kenya prior to colonialism, there was the Araku tribe that I've read about that had sort of like ownership rules for cattle and land, and there was like sort of like complex interactions in the sort of political structure of that society where you know, there was a sort of separation between men and women in terms of child rearing versus like tending the field or hunting or something along those lines. But they had processes set up that were still egalitarian in the ownership and distribution of cattle and land and such. Even though there was like a sort of separation between the genders because of sort of like, I think, pretty biological, you know, the fact that women go through childbirth and then their body has to more or less like recover from that. Yeah. So I'm saying that like there's differences that then get manifested into like the political process of production and distribution of goods.
All right, but is the pitch that's I guess necessary? Like I'm thinking about if you have, I don't know, an existing community that has like existing divisions between men and women, maybe based on the biology. Like in order for that society to move to socialism, if they didn't have a version of that already, would it be necessary to address that gender difference? And then vice versa, if they were to address the gender difference, would socialism be necessary in order to do so? So I think that's the crux of the question, right?
Yeah, wait. I'm trying to hear the first part of it. I think you had said something along the lines of, if we had taken this society that did not have those distinctions already present from historical material perspective. I'm not really quite understanding that bit. Like I guess I'm trying to understand the hypothetical that you just described, and I can't really quite repeat it back to you.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I mean, if you are assuming that there are already, gender differences due to the biological, so that was where the hypothetical was. Like, if you assume that that society already exists, the distinctions that you talk about between men and women exist, then in order to, like, well, I mean, the first question is whether friction happens to begin with. But say that friction does happen, would you need socialism in order to resolve it? Or would it need to be resolved in order to have socialism?
I guess I'm actually kind of saying that, like, regardless of the economic system, there's always going to be some sort of push for identity politics because there's differences between people, and there's sort of like I'd probably even throw out like scarce resources is always going to be a necessity, like the scarcity of land, for example. And like no matter what the system that you have, there's going to be some sort of process of the production and distribution of goods. And like if there are differences, it's like I think it can manifest into an inequality in the production distribution of goods that then needs to be resolved through identity politics.
I'm looking at the chat and I'm kind of with Young on this. I don't know if it necessarily landed on a conception of identity politics that's like stable enough. Because like whenever I think about it, and the place that I'm arguing from is like the necessity of friction between differences as classes. So like women as a class, like I don't know if it has to be like women against men or like a patriarchy or whatever in order for those differences to be resolved satisfactorily.
Yeah, so I guess I'm actually thinking that Marx had written in Capital there could be a social division of labor without class construction, and I think I'm saying that a social division of labor that is often associated with motherhood manifests into sort of like a classist struggle in a sense because of their I don't know, maybe biological reasons, I guess, because they can't, they sort of have that recovery period that then I think often gets associated with them being a mother, and then that kind of changes their relationship to food, for example, right? They'd need to find some sort of other person. I guess, like, I just feel like there would need to be at least a tackling of that issue, regardless of society. You know what I mean? Like, I don't know if there's, like, you'd have to have some sort of society where that distinction does not exist, right? Which, in my opinion, would only come about through identity politics. I also was wondering if we should address the questions in the chat too. I was trying to read that as well.
Yeah, well, it's because it sounds like the pitch is that, like, if we agree that there's biological differences that are causing an actual difference in like labor because of the recovery time, that so you're proposing that the only way to resolve those differences is through identity politics?
Real quick, can I just address a format thing too? Usually we go to questions in about 15 to 20 minutes, so I would ignore the chat until then, just to keep the debate clear.
Thank you. I didn't know
Sounds
that.
good, yeah. It was still my question though.
Yeah, so I think I had
I was
heard
just
you
agreeing.
say that if we're acknowledging that these sort of like differences occur, you're asking me is the only way to resolve them through identity politics. Is that what I heard
Right.
you say? I think that's a tough question for me to answer, and it's really kind of stuck me because maybe that is a flaw in my argument. Because then I guess how do we recognize that there is some sort of inequality or injustice going on? Because I would say that it would only occur through like in this given example, mothers coming together and talking about their individual situations and recognizing them as sort of systemic processes that occur from the production and distribution of goods and their relationship to like the decisions therein.
I guess it sounds like there's an assumption that the differences in gender or sex are always going to lead to injustices.
Yeah, that's a good point. I don't know. I think it kind of seems like you stumped me. Because I think it's like difficult because we're really arguing from a hypothetical reality here.
Yeah.
Because I guess when I look around the world today, like there's a lot of these sort of injustices that identity politics deals with, and so it's kind of like I guess we could come up with this, mental space, and like this hypothetical. So I guess like I would maybe let's say just agree that in like a hypothetical reality, we can like separate the two. But in my opinion, like I'm really concerned with the real world. And then maybe you're like thinking about a real world community that you're a part of or I guess I'm just saying that like when I look about the world, whether that's like in Ghana, you know what I'm saying, or it's out here in my hometown or whatever, like there's all these sort of like oppressions and hierarchies that need to be addressed. And also like kind of like I also believe that once we tackle white supremacy and cis heteronormativity and patriarchy, then we'll start to find other ones. That's why I brought up like partners in domestic violence situations or like children of alcoholics, etc. Like as we start to tackle the bigger ones, other identities will sort of like come up. But so were you? I guess like kind of my question: do you know a specific community that you were thinking of?
Not intimately. I haven't had a chance to make an inquiry into more of what their social dynamics look like. I'm thinking of one that might fit the bill, but I don't have the information to back that up necessarily. I also agree with you generally that when we're looking at the real world, injustices have been perpetuated against identities, like on the basis of identity. So yeah, that's unavoidable. We have to deal with that whether we go to socialism or not.
Right, and I think it was an interesting point that Kurt brought up regarding what Marx's interpretation, which I guess would be useful if we're going at this from assessing what socialism does or does not say regarding the gender division of labor. And I was wondering if PayPal had any commentary on what Marx had to say on whether or not there's like a historic gendered role of labor and what can we take from that?
Yeah, okay, before I mention this, I want to I got slightly confused. So it seemed like somewhere there, heard or somebody said something to the effect that somehow you always have some need of identity politics. I don't know if one or both of you said something like this.
I said that. I would agree with that. Yeah.
You would claim that. Sorry. Not only so, but you did say that it's theoretically possible to solve one. Let's just take one example: feminism could potentially attain its goal, but then there'll be like a hydra of things. So you chop one head and or crop up somehow.
Well, it will come to an end. I think like right now there's a whole bunch of things. There's a whole bunch of sort of like let's call them oppressions or hierarchies, right? That exist that aren't necessarily really talked about because they're somewhat a smaller scale. only affecting like 0.1% of the population as opposed to like 15 or 20% of the population or 50%, right? So I'm not saying that they're always going to be there, but I'm saying that as we start to uncover the bigger ones, like smaller ones will come to the forefront. But eventually, like until we get to like a completely equal, egalitarian society, at that point, like identity politics will not be necessary. And so, like, that's kind of what I'm saying is that like why it's necessary for socialism, because socialism is a sort of a movement that I think is constantly, like in its sort of like idealized form, let's just say, is moving towards this egalitarian, equal participants using democratic means to fulfill people's needs and live like a just life.
So just to clarify, but once socialism is achieved, you argue that that will be the end. So that there is no feminism or in socialism, or because there won't be any need for it. Is that what you're saying?
Socialism is a process. It's a political movement, and like in the process of creating class consciousness amongst the working class, where they organize and operate as a class. So identity politics are necessary, and I'm saying that like I guess what I would call it like full on communism is like once we've achieved that sort of like egalitarian society that doesn't have the need for identity politics.
Okay. I thought this was a debate between two people, so I'm confused. But why don't we go ahead and open it up to questions now? So, is anyone in the chat wanting to ask a question? Is anyone wanting to jump in and ask any of our participants clarity on their questions? What do we think? All right, Posadas Marxist tendency. Go ahead and unmute and ask your question. And then Varsity, you'll be next. Or Posadas, if you don't want to unmute, ask the question in the chat. But please hurry it up. We're recording. All right, let's go to Varsity. You can ask first, and then we'll go back to Posadas.
Feel free to pass this over if this was already addressed. Before I dropped out, I had heard Sparks ask what I thought was a good question about like is class, like economic class, is that being construed as an identity? Was that answered already? Or if not, would that be something you'd be open to discussing more?
I guess if that question's for me, I would say that yes, class is an identity, but kind of like from the idea of intersectionality, it's only one of many. And I think what we were talking about at that point, if I'm remembering correctly, is like, does this question of separating identity politics and socialism, does that necessitate that class is like the highest or the preeminent identity? So I would say that yes, it's an identity, to answer your question.
UpperLowerEastSide, I don't remember if you had answered that particular, because like you're the one that posed the question initially. So I'm curious about what you were envisioning when you posed the question.
Right. So when I posed the question, it was more about what people in general, like what people's interpretation of the relationship between identity politics and socialism would be, i.e., whether they both require each other, socialism requires identity politics only, or vice versa. So it was more of an open-ended discussion on what your beliefs were regarding the relationship between these two groups, and just more about a discussion on people's different beliefs, and just through that sort of developing a broader understanding for all of us here at the debate with regards to these two sort of significantly large topics.
All right, Sparks, you want to answer that? And then we'll go to Young's question.
I'm still thinking about like, because like when you say identity politics, UpperLowerEastSide, I imagine that you were not envisioning class being an identity in that context, because otherwise I don't think the question would be meaningful necessarily. Because obviously if class is an identity, then it has to include identity politics because it's about class.
Right. So me personally, I view class as like a social relation. They're separate from a specific identity, like your sexual orientation, gender, ethnicity, et cetera, et cetera. So I had personally, seen these as separate, but again, this is more of a free form debate, and sort of the primary goal is just interested in hearing what people have to say with regards to this subject, even regardless of my own specific definition or any one person's specific definition on this.
All right, let's go to Young's question then. Young, do you want to unmute and ask it, or would you like me to ask it?
Yeah, I can ask.
Okay, go ahead.
All right, so a little bit of background on this question. I'm trying to get to the bottom of exactly what we mean when we say identity politics, because my understanding of it is based on like the Black Panthers, like Angela Davis and intersectionality. Like the original concept, as I understand identity politics, was the assertion that class is not enough, that like your identity and class are interrelated, and you can't really separate the two from one another. And the purpose of making this distinction was to identify the intersections of where people's class interests meet, because there's going to be identity-specific things that are not going to apply to everybody. Like, for instance, if you're like a white man, cis dude who works in like an automotive factory in Detroit, you're probably going to have different issues than like a little Mexican old lady in Texas, or any number of variations of like identities that are going to have like specific cultural and ethnic backgrounds and experiences that are going to be somewhat unique to those individuals. And intersectionality was about like identifying where there were going to be specific issues that are going to be unique to some of those groups, and where there were going to be issues that are like, it doesn't matter who you are, like we all have a collective class interest, this is all the same struggle, whatever those things that they come to agree are their struggles in that regard. Like the whole point of it was an organizing strategy to build solidarity, to be like, hey, we can have differences over like white and black and this and that and the other. Those are more complex questions, like things like sexism. Like that's as old as time. That's a really hard one. That's probably going to be around for a while. But I think the assertion of like Black Panther socialist politics was that you can't hope to meaningfully address things like racism and sexism and whatnot until you address things at the economic level. That until you even the playing field as far as material conditions go, you can't really know who is acting in bad faith because of their material interests and who's just like being a dick or being prejudiced or whatever. And so I think that there's like that's my understanding of it. Now, I want to contrast that with what I think a lot of people are kind of discussing in the more modern context, which, I mean, this is a little opinion on my part, to be clear, but it's my understanding, like, under neoliberal capitalism, because capitalism is seeking to reproduce more of the same system, as a function, as like a defense mechanism of that system co-opts radical movements that fundamentally are at odds with its like economic ideology, like it's the profit incentive at the end of the day being like the thing that guides everything, or the price mechanism, or however you'd like to describe it. But 1 second, slight brain fart. The result of that is that when you get radical ideas to build solidarity, like intersectionality and identity politics as its original conception, as like a thing that was designed to build solidarity between different movements and different people, under neoliberal capitalism, that has become like a hierarchical, it's like grievance politics competition. The question was, what is identity politics in this context? Which one are we describing? The one that I just described previously, or the one that I'm talking about right now, which is the neoliberal capitalism grievance politics thing, where instead of it being a way for people to build solidarity between one another.
All right, bro. Can you maybe? Sorry, you just went on a long time. I think the contestants are forgetting the question. Could you maybe just ask distinctly? I appreciate you giving us the background, but could you maybe just ask?
Are we discussing this in the context of the former definition or the latter? Are we talking about it as a tool to build solidarity between people, or are we talking about it as a tool to like assert like my identity, like I have suffered more and therefore my grievances are more legitimate and therefore like higher on the priority list, versus being like, do we have the same problems and are we using this as a strategy to address the same problems?
All right, Sparks, let's start with you. What do you think?
So I'm thinking that like of these two different things, like addressing identity politics or addressing intersectionality, and I think I also talked about this in the thread when we were talking about identity politics. I think addressing intersectionality is useful. I am, and what I said before about like if you want global domination socialism, it's going to be necessary because that like addressing intersectionality is how it's like your best bet at building a kind of social cohesion by acknowledging those differences while refocusing on class. So sort of like intersectionality is used as a tool to reduce friction to focus on like the socialist movement. And then thinking about it of like the neoliberal identity politics is just a distraction. I obviously agree with that.
Okay, Kurt, you want to answer that?
Yeah, thank you for the question, young Boldriad. I think like I think I agree largely with your synopsis. I think there's one aspect I'd like to add, is that the identity politics of the 70s, the Combahee River Collective, there's this like epistemological process, right? Through getting together and talking about individual experiences and then understanding those experiences then as like a systemic process, right? And so I think that like that's the thing I'm talking about. So that does not really fit in with the consumerist identity politics, let's say, of this sort of like egoic putting on badges and like, you know, this sort of like winning a competition, you know, that you're describing. I think most people here are against that sort of neoliberal identity politics you were describing.
All right, Upper Lower East Side, would you like to answer before we move on?
Sure. So I think in general, just to build off of Kurt's point, I think sort of the neoliberal identity politics is like the lowest hanging fruit definition of identity politics out there. Just self-serving, so to speak, to like the neoliberal political order that it sort of doesn't even really need a takedown, because it's sort of like the dead horse, if you will, of like internet politics. And I think that sort of building on other aspects of identity politics can have a more meaningful, broader political discussion. With that said, I personally am in the camp of sort of socialism needing to draw on like, you know, elements of identity politics. I think we mentioned the Combahee River Collective with regards to lesbian black women as an example, and for the development of like the working class movement, that given how diverse the working class is, that this sort of necessitates drawing on identity politics in order to form that cohesion that would presumably be necessary for the movement to succeed.
All right, you there? Would you like to unmute and ask your question about the liability?
I'm in the car. I don't know how wise that is. It might be better to read it.
Okay, I can read it for you. Thank you. All right. So we'll start maybe with Kurt. How much do you think IDPOL is a tactical liability for socialism as a movement that is competing with others, that it invites a reciprocal response or infighting? I understand the point about it being a tool for highlighting class or group conflict, but wouldn't it also mean a weakness exploitable by, say, conservatives or false flags who want to destabilize the movement with its own tools? How do you feel about that?
Yeah, I would say there is certainly that liability. I think there's a liability, for example, with liberal unions when it comes to implementing socialism. So I think like largely, like the call out culture, let's say, where this you can't speak because you're privileged, etc. nonsense, you know what I mean? Where it's like a tool of power within these systems, within these movements. Like there's certainly bad identity politics, and I think like what I would largely respond to is that like we need to have like good identity politics, and I think also like a really huge component of like infighting is actually like personal growth and accountability and like becoming a more mature, emotionally stable person, able like to have like form attachments with other people. Like I'm not saying that from like I'm better than anybody. I've had serious attachment wounds and stuff from my childhood and stuff, but I just noticed that like you have to have more than just identity politics. There has to be like a sort of like human to human connection as well, and I think that like human connection is what's really going to overcome that sort of infighting.
All right. Upper Lower East Side, go ahead.
I guess to build off of Kurtz's point, I remember reading with regards to there's a union meeting in Kansas City, and this was I believe she was like a white woman in her 30s, and she was listening to this Hispanic lady discuss her trials and tribulations regarding raising two kids on minimum wage, and she sort of had this kumbaya movement with regards to sort of the connections between her own struggles and that of other people. And so I think an important part with regards to both building any movement with regards to either socialism or identity politics or the synergy between them is the sort of on the ground, social connections, whether it be sort of new labor unions or community groups, et cetera, that helps build that cohesion. And in America, this is something that's been chipped away. We had Taft-Hartley, we had sort of this demonization of unions or sort of any sort of political movement beyond like the Rotary Club or the Chamber of Commerce. And so I think to just build on that, I definitely think that like on the ground community groups is how this movement sort of develops into something more cohesive and more sustainable.
All right, and then Sparks, can you give your response to that question, and then we will wrap it up.
Yeah, so I'm thinking about that idea of having human to human connection, building cohesion on the ground level. I'm curious about like we're focusing on the human to human connection. Does identity politics even have to come up? Like if we're already associating with each other on that level and we already have the capacity to do so on that level, then what is identity politics for?
Can I respond to that?
Yeah, we're quick. And then Varsity has one more question after that. Go ahead.
Well, yeah, I guess like even if you're interacting with somebody on a human to human level, you also have to recognize that there's like real material differences between your experiences, and like there has to be this sort of like understanding that a lot of those material differences, like real like lived experiences, not just like money and stuff, they have to come from systemic identities. It's like systemic oppression that creates like identities. Like there has to be a component of the human and a component of the identity recognition.
All right. Anyone want to respond to that, or can we move on to the next question?
I don't know. I think it might maybe expand this more than we're maybe because it goes back to the question about like what identity politics is again, because when you're looking at what society is like now, like yes, we have these systemic ills, we have harms that were done, because of the systems that exist currently, and addressing intersectionality is, I would say, extremely important for the human to human connection. And I don't know if I think addressing intersectionality is the same thing as identity politics.
Right, fair enough. Varsity, go ahead and ask your question.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, thank God. So I was kind of wondering if, and anybody can answer this question, do you think that identity politics has yet to capture all of the possible identities that might exist? That are there any identities that you think are left out of the discourse around identity politics, whatever that is, whatever we take that to mean, that you think should be kind of included in the conversation? Like, because I think typically there are a couple of identities, like race, gender, sexual orientation, things of that nature, around which politics of identity have been organized. What are people's thoughts on groups that, like, say, someone like Marx would have grouped under the so-called like lumpen proletariat, which, like, to bring that up to today, might include like people with addiction issues, mental illness, sex workers, things of that nature. Do you think there's a place for first of all, would you even consider these to be identities of the same type, as like race, gender, class, if we're including that as an identity? And do you think there's a place for these identities to be included in the identity politics discourse, I guess, if you want to call it that? Hope that makes sense.
Wait, I was confused about the Marx part. Like, there was sort of I'm reading it. You said there's sorts of identities that Marx and Engels typically grouped under the so-called lumpen proletariat. How does that relate to the?
Well, I guess just sort of presaging it with this kind of idea that historically these have been groups that even a leftist philosopher like Marx has kind of considered. It's like this view that it's okay to kind of leave these out of the discussion because these were groups that Marx did not think had, as far as I understand it, Marx did not think these were groups that had what he considered revolutionary potential.
Oh, that's very interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, Kurt, you say things. I have things.
Oh, I guess I think I had kind of referenced earlier that as more and more of the, like, let's say major, let's say women are 50% of the population, for example, and I don't know what percentage of them experience some sort of like gender-based trauma, but I'm going to say that that's like a large percentage of the human population, and so that seems to be a pretty forefront thing. And so I guess what I had said earlier, I'm not sure if you'd caught it, but that as we start to deal with, let's say, patriarchy, as we start to deal with racism and white supremacy, as we start to deal with those other identities, will be able to come to the forefront, and they'll be realized. For example, one of my examples is like a straight white kid that was sort of like an abusive family situation. You know what I mean? That's not really recognized in the political discourse, but I would say that that's still like an identity based on like oppression. So I'm saying that there are identities that are not recognized, but as we sort of deal and become a mature society, more egalitarian society, other identities will continue to pop up until we eventually get to a completely egalitarian society where power is equally distributed.
All right, Sparks, go ahead.
Yeah, I think it's super interesting that Marx and Engels considered a lumpen proletariat that is excluded from the discourse because they don't have revolutionary potential. The patient rights movement, with deinstitutionalization in the United States, with the invention of the patient rights movement, I've been working as a peer support specialist for the past 3 years. That entire movement comes out of the patient rights movement. which is that people with mental illnesses, even severe mental illnesses, are themselves a class in that sense. And with revolutionary potential, there has been significant advocacy on that front, and that is still ongoing.
All right. Let's go to Upper Lower East Side. Do you want to add anything, and then we will end there?
Yeah, so I think it's definitely interesting with regards to what is considered lumpen or not, and whether or not these identities would be incorporated into either identity politics or socialism. And I wonder if this sort of definition of lumpen is more used within like Marxist-Leninist circles, and whether or not other Marxists have different interpretations with regards to how Marx and Engels saw it in the mid 19th century, and what can we gain from that now in 2023. But I feel like in terms of like what identity politics has covered in terms of identities, I think the difference or the issue with regards to who is not covered is more in terms of how identity politics operates perhaps within our like media and political sphere. One example could be migrants. We're dealing with the Titan submersible disappearance here, and it certainly garnered more media attention than the migrant boat that capsized off of the Greek coast that has hundreds of people dead. And we're focused a lot more of our energy on 3 billionaires, one of their sons, and the CEO. And I think that we sort of see this more trickle down approach with regards to how we face identity politics. We're in Pride Month, and the LGBTQ flag is out in many areas, and so I think we as a society have reached an acknowledgement that some of these identity groups exist, but I think there's definitely a lot of room with regards to media and politics in terms of sort of making those identity groups feel more included within our broader political and social sphere.
Okay. Well, thank you all for participating tonight. Thank you, Upper Lower East Side, for organizing this event. We appreciate it. Yeah, would anyone like to say like a last word, and then we'll cut it off? None?
I'd just like to say thanks, everybody, for giving me the opportunity to talk.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that went all right.
I just want to say thank you all for participating. I thought it was a good discussion.
Yeah, I thought it was great.
All right. Thank you all. So Lego, go ahead, end the recording.